Okay, it says we're recording.
It does.
Okay, great. Welcome to Building a Learning Community, Episode 3, the third in this series. We'll take a look at what should I be learning? We will discuss the fundamentals expected at various levels of skill, how to cultivate fundamentals, discussing plateaus and decline, and how we feel these skills ought to apply to various SCA award structures on a very general basis. Over the course of this series, we will provide you with the tools necessary to build a learning community at your own practice and a blueprint for how to use them. I am your moderator, Maestra Brigid, and I will be guiding the conversation with some of these experts. Let's meet our panelists. Let's start with you, Dante.
Hi, I'm Master Dante DiPietro. I have been fencing for about 20 years. I'm a member of the Order of the Laurel and of Defense. And in my professional life, I have about 16, maybe 17 years now in professional education.
Awesome. Master Gavin.
I'm Gavin Kapler. I'm a member of the Order of Defense from Callantyre. So I mostly do an Italian rapier sort of thing, and I've been fencing for about 10 years.
And Valbrand.
Hi, I'm Valbrand Rothen's brother. I have been fencing since the early 90s, and I am mundanely a theoretical physicist. So I study how to stab things.
Stab things and throw them into space. All right. So we're going to get started here on what are skills and what should we be learning. We'll start with authorizations and what we are at the edge between novice and advanced beginner. Let's start with Dante.
Okay, so if we look at this, so we're using novice as part of the Dreyfus model for skill acquisition here. And for those purposes, a novice is really someone who is brand new to something and doesn't know very much about it. The novice is someone who, if you're cooking something, has to follow a recipe exactly, doesn't know, why you're supposed to put in a teaspoon of salt versus a tablespoon, that sort of thing. Very, ground level, basic knowledge. If we look at this from the perspective of the Bloom's domains for psychomotor and cognitive, we're looking at like just basic vocabulary, remembering, understanding what terms even mean, having a general sense of what's going on around them, while they're taking these actions, being able to feel their bodies move and so forth. And what you find is that at the novice level, when you're preparing someone for authorization, you actually have to front load a lot of the total number of skills that are available. It's in the later levels of skill that you really refine those and start to execute them with better judgment. But early on, I would even go so far as to say prior to authorizing, we're looking at someone should be able to advance and retreat effectively. They should be able to do a passing step. I'm going to be using Italian rapier terms, but pick your appropriate synonym if it doesn't fit with what you're doing. But you should be able to form a guard. You should know how to form a counter posture, find the sword, lunge and recover, parry and riposte, disengage or cavazione. You should know how to grip the sword effectively and properly. And if you're in a place that uses cuts, you should be able to learn how to do cuts with just the wrist or with a stiff arm, like Fabris describes in his manual. So that's a good 10 different things, some of which with multiple parts. And this is also the stage of things where understanding the terminology comes in. Because if you don't learn the vocabulary, then when you start to try to learn more complicated things, you don't have the words to group together into more complicated sets of actions. So at the novice level, someone should be learning the lines above, below, inside, outside, the 4 different guards, true and false edge, different parts of the sword, what a line is, whether it's open or closed, what that means, opposition, obedience, presence, the different measures, and some of the basic names for cuts. Just all the vocabulary things that a person needs to be able to even enter into discussions about what's going on. And so at the beginner stage, the novice stage, from a training perspective, if you've got somebody who's a real rookie like this, the big things that they need to be looking for to be able to build themselves out of through this understanding is, they need to follow your directions. They need to pretty much just, read the back of the box, mix the cookies up, put them in the oven exactly as they're supposed to be. Novices don't really make decisions with what they're doing because they don't have a sense of why they're doing anything yet. Because when you're brand new to something, you can't be expected to know why you're doing things yet. And at that novice level of things, the biggest, most important thing that they should be doing is drilling as much as possible to get themselves familiar with how the actions should feel when they're done correctly. Drilling for that mechanical familiarity to both have the physical familiarity and also learning all the vocabulary so that you can talk about what's going on with you physically. Those are pretty much the big steps that somebody should be looking at as a novice. And those can be hard to teach.
I really liked your analogy of the box of ingredients and reading off the box of the ingredients. What you mentioned in a place where you might use cuts. Do we have anywhere that doesn't use cuts? I was wondering about that.
Well, most SCA is the rapier rules don't use percussive cuts as a default. So that certainly changes things versus being in a place like Callantyr where cut and thrust is just the only thing and only game in town.
I was thinking along the lines of like draw cuts and push cuts and stuff like that too.
Oh, no, I mean, we do cut and thrust as our default system. So to authorize, you're going to be delivering cuts at your authorization, and they need to be correct, or you're just punching people with a sword. And that's, a good way to fail.
It's a good way to not make friends.
I guess it's one of the things that I'd like to point out, right? So one of the things that we do in the SCA is your authorization, as a general rule, doesn't test for skill. It tests for safety. And that's all there is. And I see you making the air quotes, Dante, and you're right. We authorize people to say, hey, they're safe on the field. Whether or not they have the requisite skills to be safe on the field is a separate question, and one that is often not addressed, right? So whether or not somebody has the ability to advance and retreat is not something that we necessarily, check for, right? Are they advancing and retreating correctly? No, we don't care about that. Are they advancing and retreating safely? Safely is the thing that we test for. And these things, these fundamental skills, right, and having a list of fundamental skills that you want to see and demonstrate, can you cut correctly? Can you lunge correctly? Can you exercise the judgment of when to lunge correctly, right, is a thing that is fundamental to that line of a novice, right? You need to get to that point wherein you have enough of the language, you have enough of the rote memorization of the skills to be safe. And so, you have to be able to successfully defend yourself, right? You need to not just be standing there like a deer in the headlights getting hit, or throwing your sword onto somebody and hurting them, right? These are but these are well-defined skills that we could objectively measure, and perhaps that's something that should be done at the authorization level.
Yeah, we worry about whether or not someone has exposed skin on their ankles, but we don't worry about whether or not someone is exposing their face every time they hurl their body forward at high speeds.
Yeah.
So I think
oh, go on, Kevin.
I was going to say, it's worth, I think, to be a little clear what we mean by skills before we really continue this discussion much further. These are discrete things that a person can have the ability to do. They should be measurable, and they should be something that doesn't really rely on outside things happening to make them something the person can perform. So like an advance is a skill that a person can do. Either they successfully advanced or they didn't. Now you can get into gradations of a better or worse advance, but that's not dependent on some context or whether their opponent has done something, which makes it very measurable. And that's, I think, an important distinction for what we're talking about. Trying to set up, a concrete expectation that is something that a person can perform regardless of context, because again, the novice can't process context.
That's a very good point, Kevin. Yeah, and all of these things that Dante has listed are skills that literally come down to, these are things that you can drill by yourself without an opponent. And these are the fundamental language of swordplay. Advance, retreat, guard, counter posture, find the sword, lunge and recover, parry, riposte. These are things that can be done and drilled independently of working with another human being. When I first started fencing, we won't discuss how many years ago because I'll feel old. I started in an Olympic style, and the first 6 months that I spent going to that cell 2 days a week, I didn't have a sword in my hand. I literally just drilled fundamental footwork for 6 months before I started to drill fundamental guard work, because that's what you needed to do. And we don't in the SCA do that. We put a sword in somebody's hand the first day and say, here, have some fun and try and learn this. And that's very overwhelming to people who have never had this type of exposure before, right? Exposure to these types of skills. And so I'm not coming here to say, you should spend 6 months doing footwork. I mean, you should spend 6 months doing footwork, but that's not the best way to encourage people to stay. It's the best way to encourage people to become good at a thing. And those are not necessarily the same thing. So, from my point of view, yeah, you want to learn these fundamental skills and you want to drill them, but we need to do that in a way that makes it fun and engaging, so that you continue to come back and want to continue to learn and progress and get better at the skill.
So that's a good point, but I know that we do put a sword in people's hands because we want them to think fencing's fun, and at the same time we need to get them to learn the fundamentals, and so telling them to do footwork for 6 months means we're probably not going to retain them. Yeah. Which is unfortunate.
Well, I mean, that's fair. And to be clear, right? If you're going to stick with this, you're going to be doing footwork for a lot more than 6 months. What do we all do? Footwork.
Right? So one of the things I wanted to touch back on is getting this back to being at the edge between novice and advanced beginner. And Valbrand, you mentioned that these are all skills, the skills that Dante mentioned at the start of this segment, are skills that one can learn at home by themselves. But at the same time, like, we need people to find appropriate teachers to learn these skills as well. So I don't necessarily know that saying you can go home and do these things all the time is genuine either.
Well, so there's a couple of things going on in there. Let's see if I can form a response that addresses all of them. So first, it is possible to practice those things on your own. The flip side of it is that you need to know that you're practicing it correctly. And as a novice, you don't know. You simply don't know that you're doing it correctly. So you need some sort of external validation from someone who can say, yes, you're doing this correctly. You've done it correctly now, 20 times in a row. Go home and practice that more, because one of the things that we definitely can say for sure is that going to practice once a week for an hour or two is not enough practice to internalize these things quickly. And if you are looking at crossing over from novice to advanced beginner, the big difference between those two layers of things is the advanced beginner is now able to actually apply those solo drill type items that we were just talking about. They can actually use them in context against an opponent, to solve familiar problems. Like, oh, my opponent has parried. What do I do? Now I know to disengage. That sort of thing. Very basic stuff, but somebody who's, really new, if you parry their sword, even if they know to disengage, they may just push back really hard. Because that's what I did the first time somebody parried my sword, was I tried to push back. It didn't work because I didn't know anything. I didn't know better at the time. And so at this advanced beginner level, we're taking those prior actions and starting to apply them consistently, and we can start to incorporate some other skills as well. But we're dealing with things at a mechanistic level, basically single level actions. Maybe a parry riposte if you want to count that as 2 or 1. I'm not going to split hairs about that. But you're not going to start seeing complicated integrations of multiple actions at this stage yet. So we're at this point, we're looking at feints, invitations, maybe a counter disengage or contra cavazione, however you want to think of it. A half cavazione, things that are kind of variations on those earlier skills that do sort of require an opponent now. Yielding to an attack, to a parry or an attack, being able to make use of that counter posture to enter into wide measure, to gain measure, starting to look at, tempo, and learning, because now we're applying, remember, we're learning the 5 tempi to attack in, that sort of thing. And so the advanced beginner starts to look at being able to repeat sort of simple if-then maxims. Like, if my opponent parries, I will disengage. If my opponent steps forward toward me and I have an open line, I will attack. If my opponent, lifts their sword up to cut, I will lunge during the elevation of the blade. There's not a lot of thought that goes into it, but there are sort of these mechanical if-then statements that get built. And so if you're at that advanced beginner level, which I would say correlates sort of with that, baronial fighting award / AOA level fighting award sort of zone, that people kind of reach toward.
Dante, you've jumped like
Yeah,
way
you
through
jumped ahead.
and actually need to discuss how you train a novice before we go halfway into,
So yeah,
I thought that was the next episode.
Maybe not. So we have the various levels of looking at authorization, AOA level, grant of arms level, and peerage level. And when we're looking at when someone authorizes, we're looking at them to be a novice that's able to do all of these single actions correctly and safely. And then the edge between novice, where they authorize, and advanced beginner, where they start to employ these if-thens, I think is where we're getting into the AOA. Am I following you correctly, Gavin? That's what I was thinking.
Oh, I was thinking we probably need to sort of rehash some things before we just moved on to the next topic to just make sure they were clear. So like novice needs to learn actions, their mechanics. That's going to look like doing repetitions of drills. It's going to look like homework. But you, as Dante was pointed out now several minutes ago, you also have to be very careful. They have no mechanism for checking themselves. So like you can't just say go home and lunge. You have to give them something they can screw up. It's kind of the quick recap that I think we need to end novice on before we jump to talking about advanced beginner.
I agree. In that the most important part of that is that you need competent feedback. You need somebody who knows what is right and what is wrong to be able to point out that, oh, you lunged and you dropped your knee away from your toe, or all those mechanical things. You need actual real good feedback, because when you are a novice, you don't know why doing it this way is better than doing it that way. You just need the real feedback that says this is the right way, and we can discuss why it's the right way after you figure out how to do it the right way. And that's the difference between a novice and an advanced beginner. Is the advanced beginner is starting to understand why this is the right way, but they haven't got there yet. The novice is somebody who needs that feedback to say, this is what is correct, and you have to do it this way, because there is an objective right and there is an objective wrong to how to do these fundamental skills.
Before we move on from novice, one of the things I really wanted to get a feel from you guys on this panel is, at what point do you feel a novice should attempt to authorize? Or more so, at what point should a local marshal feel confident that their student is ready to authorize?
That's a really good question. I'll try to sort of field that to start with. When I, have somebody that I've taught, and they're looking to go and authorize, the first thing that I'm looking for is, can they perform those skills I would say adequately? Can they do by rote memorization? Can they advance? Can they retreat? Can they form a guard? Can they lunge? All of those things. And there's this other thing that is really important that I don't think very many people talk about is, are they scared to do it? Are they scared to do it? And are they scared to get hit? Are they scared to hit? And those two things are, to me, the most important question for, are you ready to authorize? Are you scared to get hit? Are you scared to hit somebody? And can you perform these sets of actions? If the answer to all of those questions is yes, I think you're ready to authorize. You may or may not pass that authorization, but that's the point of the process. But you should be able to, perform these skills that you have been drilling for some time and adequately demonstrate that you know what they are and how to use them, and demonstrate the ability to use them in context without fear.
So for me, the line for when someone should authorize ends up, by the definitions we're using, being in the advanced beginner category. Because what I want them to be able to do is use footwork to at least have some ability to control measure. I want them to be able to use parries and ripostes when someone attacks them. And I want them to be able to attack when there is an opening. There's not, that's not a complex end of where advanced beginner spans, but it is at the beginning of that category and not, strictly speaking, in the novice category.
Okay. Dante.
Yeah, and I would generally, I don't disagree with either of those assessments. I think that in order to authorize, I think someone needs to have crossed over into the realm where they can apply some of what they've been drilling successfully. And of those things, I think the things that I prioritize more so than anything else, or that I look for more so than anything else, is the ability to do a lunge correctly and recover, and the ability to do a parry riposte. If somebody can't disengage particularly well, but they're trying to, that's okay. It's not going to cause safety issues. But if you can't lunge because you are, you're throwing your body forward and then your arm, or you're putting your hip into it or something like that, or or you're not parrying effectively, those are things that cause impacts in excess of what we're going for. If you lunge head first and then stick your arm out, you are eventually going to get clobbered. If you fling your sword arm forward, you are eventually going to clobber someone. If your parries don't work the way that they should, you are eventually going to get someone who blasts through your sword because you're not parrying well, and you're going to get clobbered. So to me, these things are all closely interconnected, in that the safest way to fence is also the good way to fence. And so I want to see those things. They don't have to be mastered, but they need to be at least emergent and show that the person understands how to not risk whiplash in a heated situation. Not heated, but an energetic in an energetic situation.
Yeah. I was getting ready to disagree with all of you guys and say, oh, I think we should authorize at the novice, and then I realized that the things you're describing are what I authorize people at. So I think we're actually all at the same level, because
I wanted to point out one more thing.
One second. So if we're looking at the novice, where we're expecting them to just be able to do the things they're drilling, when I authorize someone, I try and do all of the things that are going to be more real life. So, I make sure that the opponent pushes them and, aggresses in a way to see how will they react if they get rushed, or, how do you react when you lose your main hand and you have to fight offhand, and things like that. And so that is kind of getting into the early stages of the advanced beginner. I review.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree. But I guess the thing that I wanted to bring back around on the guitar is the thing that Dante pointed out at the beginning, that so many of these skills are front loaded, right? In terms of what you have to do in order to get from novice to advanced beginner, where we want to see, can you do that? And fencing is one of those skills where there is literally just so many things that you have to have some idea about. He listed 10 basic skills, right? That's a lot, and that's a whole lot to be able to put in your head. And one of the things that we often do is rush people to authorization, right? Because we want to get them out on the field. And I think in some ways that does people a disservice, because they haven't had the opportunity to spend time with these skills, to learn them to the point where they can get to advanced beginner before we put the sword in their hand and authorize them and send them out to play with everybody else. And that's, I think, a disservice, because these are not things that you can learn in an hour a week. That's you can't expect to authorize in 6 months if you're trying to learn these things for an hour, maybe 2 a week. That's an unrealistic expectation, and I don't think that we as a community sort of let people know that, and that we people show up to practice, they drill for an hour or two and they go home and they don't do anything at home, and they want to authorize in 2 months or 3 months, and they haven't built those fundamental skills. And that's and we as a community, try and rush people to authorization so that they can go and play and fight in tournaments and do all that stuff. It's really worth your time to sit and spend time working on, being a novice. And this is a thing that we don't often tell people, that it's okay to be a novice. It's okay to not be good at this. It's okay to learn and drill your fundamentals. And you should be doing that, because it's okay to be new at something. Take that time, be new at it, learn it, because that's really the joy that I think the four of us, here have spent, I don't know, what do we got between us? 70 odd years of combat experience.
A lot.
Right. And, we've, and what do? We drill our footwork, and we drill parries, and we do these things.
All right.
Because that's what we do. Because that's, and as we get, as we go from here to talking about competent and proficient and expert, because that's where we're going next. What's the difference between, the advanced beginner and somebody who's competent, right? They're doing the same things. They're drilling the same things. It's the same drills. It's the same fundamentals. But what you're learning is not those fundamentals. It's not the fundamental muscle memory. It's the why and the how and all of that. And that's what comes after. But it all starts with that fundamental layer of, can you do those skills?
Very good. Thank you. So I think unless there's something more to say about novice and the stage at which we think people should authorize, I'd actually like to move on to the advanced beginner and not quite yet competent. Let's give each phase its own, due process.
Well, I kind of overshot on advanced beginner, but I'll wrap up my bit, and then perhaps
we can go back a little.
Yeah, it's
we
okay.
can recap.
So the big things with the with advanced beginner, like we've been saying, is just being able to apply stuff. And so an advanced beginner is someone who is able to do those very simple if then sorts of statements, like if someone attacks me, on the above inside line, what do I do? And an advanced beginner is able to compare situations and talk about how they're different in a meaningful way, whereas a novice can't really do that. But one of the issues that advanced beginners have is they can give answers and feel like they have answers finally. And that's an important part of why authorization should happen at the early parts of this, because if someone authorizes and they don't know what to do afterward, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance there of, I can do this thing, but no, I can't. And that rattles people. But the advanced beginner, they have those answers, but they're not able to determine the correctness of their answers. How do
you mean?
You ever ask somebody a question and they answer you with a statement that clearly sounds like it has a question mark at the end of it?
Yes.
When you ask your student what happened in that fight, and they go,
I died?
Right. And there's, they hit my face, like that sort of thing.
It's a factually true statement, but it is not a helpful.
But it's not helpful.
Okay. Yeah, and there's no confidence behind it, or if there is confidence, there's entirely too much. The advanced beginner is the level where people start to get tricked into thinking that, that what works for me is a thing that exists, and it's really not the case. The advanced beginner is just starting to put these different pieces together and seeing how they connect, but they don't really have the experience or the context to have gone through those discrete mechanical actions enough to see how they interrelate, and how having your palm turned sideways is in fact much worse than having it turned upwards in certain situations. So they sort of do things that they're familiar with, but there's no judgment involved. It's all just trying stuff that they're familiar with and hoping for the best. And they can't tell beforehand if it's the right answer or not. So that's why you'll get people who, they try to parry, but they don't parry the way that they should have. So they know what they needed to do. If I get attacked over here,
too hard or too far, they parry it like way out here.
Or just the angle is wrong or something, and it just doesn't, something to make it not work right. And they may not be able to tell, or they probably won't be able to tell, but they know that a parry should have happened, but they don't know why it was the wrong parry, or why you shouldn't have stepped that way. They just knew they were trying to do something. So there's an absence of judgment.
So, I think the recipe analogy really is an important one here in this advanced beginner. But before, when we were a novice, we were talking about the recipe for what to do. And now we have we start getting recipes for when to do them, but they're still just a recipe. When X, do Y, but there's no context there. There's another piece of information that's, you can't see because you don't know it exists. It is an important part of that part of this advanced beginner. The other thing I think that isn't obvious is, number one, some people are going to show up day one with some advanced beginner type skills. Like if they were in another martial art, they may be able to, react to keeping distance. They may understand that when I'm attacked, I block in a particular way and I respond, but they're not necessarily doing those motions correctly for the sport we're doing. But on the flip side of that, like this advanced beginner category actually has a lot of territory in it. And you know, on one end, you're like, well, at the bottom end of advanced beginner, it's as basic as someone stabs at you, so you parry. Because that's actions in context, right? On the extreme end, you're going to be able to perform feints and invitations and use them in your fight in a very narrow way, right? And that's a far more advanced skill than, you know,
I need to parry. Right.
I feel like on some level that actually comes towards the plateau and decline in the false peak conversation.
Yeah.
I see a lot of people who get to advanced beginner and then they're like, haha, I can feint. I'm going to stomp at them and then I'll scare them and then I will stab them because that worked on someone in my practice once. And I'll see those people and they're very excited and sure of themselves.
And because that stomp, that feint you're talking about is a recipe. Yes. I do X, they do Y, I do Z.
I learned this thing.
and that's even sort of in the middle of advanced beginner, you know, because what we can end up seeing is people who, you know, because the stomping your foot is not one of the better feints. I think we can all agree. But sometimes you get people who have fairly good, fairly good individual technical skills at a particular thing, like say a feint. Somebody might have a really good feint, but if they're not pushing themselves into into broadening their horizons constantly, if they're just sort of going to practice without a plan for how to improve on that or to build things off of it, they'll do this one very technically adept feint regardless of context and regardless of anything else. And that's why you can
context is really like something like you're like, why did that person do that there?
Yeah, it's because what happens is with enough naive practice like that, where they're not consciously trying to improve, everything becomes automatic, whether it's appropriate or not. It becomes what they do because it's all they can do. And that's why you can run into people who are very successful because they have good technical skills. But once you figure out how to beat that person, suddenly they're no longer a challenge. It's because their skill level is actually in the advanced beginner category because they've gotten really good at a very narrow and inflexible set of actions. And when they no longer can branch out of that set of actions, all you have to do is defeat those actions and there's nothing behind it.
That reminds me of trying to explain to someone, oh, when you fight this person, they're gonna do a deep lunge to the left. So when you throw their shot, throw it there and they'll intercept your shot. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, and then you watch it happen and they're like, oh, that worked. I was like,
yep. That's a perfect example of the recipe. And I think it's also worth understanding that why talking about skills is important rather than performance gets brought up in exactly this way. I can create a highly effective fencer who will win a lot of fights if they know how to lunge correctly. And there's something called the 5 tempi in which to strike. If they there is a listing of 5 opportunities to hit someone that shows up in a couple Italian rapier manuals. If I teach someone to lunge correctly and only lunge when one of those 5 things, and I mean one of those 5 things, and everything else is just parry retreat, with those 3 skills, I bet you they'd win 70% of their fights.
It Easily. Sounds like that would be an effective counterpuncher.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I guess here's the thing that I would like to point out is that of all these different categories, novice, advanced beginner, competent, proficient, expert, the biggest class is advanced beginner.
By far.
By far. And one of the things that is perhaps to many people disconcerting is they're still an advanced beginner. And so what I would like to talk about next is how to get people from advanced beginner to competent and proficient, because that's a skill in and of itself, right? Teaching somebody to bridge that gap is a skill in and of itself. And there are people like Meister Brigid who are very good at teaching people the basics and the fundamentals and getting them to be an advanced beginner. But it is a hard skill to get somebody from advanced beginner to competent. And so, Dante, I would like you to talk about the difference between those two.
Sure.
And
also about false peaks. You didn't mention that.
So that's fair. So I guess this is a way to address that plateau, because that's the fundamental problem that I'm trying to address here, is that plateau at the level of advanced beginner. And that plateau is a skill plateau that may not be a performance plateau, right? Those are two different things. If you find yourself, in a performance plateau where, you're consistently getting to, top 16 or, whatever, right? And then falling out there, that's a performance plateau. That's not necessarily a skill plateau. And those are two different things. Does that make sense?
I think that's a really good point that Gavin also brought up, which is, he could get someone to a very high level of performance with very few skills. I think we've all seen the person who wins like their local and baronial tourneys by, pushing through with the barest of advanced beginner.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So if we're looking at how to get into competency, competency is.
Well, first, can we define what we mean by competency? So
yes,
we have a vocabulary to discuss this.
Yeah, that I will. So what we're looking at with competency is all of those simple actions that we were previously applying in advanced beginner, we start to chain them together at competency. Bloom's calls it a complex overt response, which is essentially meaning, you're connecting different mechanisms together. So, cavation, contra cavation, recavation, those things all start to link. And now you're using footwork to open up the line and then lunge. And so these different discrete skills are starting to become integrated into things that happen all together. And a competent person is now able to start analyzing things in a way where they can see how those earlier concepts interrelate and connect. So instead of having a list of rules to follow, they can actually start making rules about which rules to apply and when. They can start making rules of relevancy about those different maxims. So competency is really where we start to see the fencer make actual choices about what they're doing. Do I want to do this here, or do I want to do this other thing? Was that right? Was that a right decision? They'll start to understand, did I make a good choice, or did I just do it wrong? Because competency is where a person can finally start to self-evaluate through guess and check. And beforehand, you can't, because you don't know remember that you don't know about right answers. You can't judge your own answers, so you can't guess and check. And so for competency, we start to look at drills that require timing and judgment, as opposed to just looking for them to do it right or not. We want them to do it right and be successful with some resistance, some genuine resistance. Chaining things together into a decision tree. Like if I faint, and they don't respond, what do I do? If I feint and they parry, what do I do? If I feint and they respond by thrusting at my face, what do I do? Starting to link things together in that way. And this is also where, where we start to see things along, this is where we start to see things along the realm where coaching someone on how to handle their fights, like Brigid was mentioning earlier, starts to be useful as opposed to just teaching them what to do. Like, the difference between what do you do versus how do you handle these situations, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
One of the things that we would do at Penzic for the champions team, these are all people who are at least competent. And we would build a file of index cards of all of the fencers that we frequently fight in the East Kingdom, Atlantia, Ethelmark, and Anstiera, Meridian, wherever they were from. And we would have a Rolodex of the opposing fighters. And so we'd go up and we'd say, hey, your opponent's probably going to do this, this, or this. Or what type of opponent would you like? Do you want a technical fight? Do you want a fast fight? Do you want a lefty? Do you want this? And so that would be, Dante wants to see his card. But yeah, so that's that level of being able to give that evaluation and that feedback. When I think about this level, which is kind of like the competent GOA, white scarf, bronze ring, Order of the Golden Rapier level, I describe it as you can control and make dominant decisions in the dance. You go out, you're part of this dance, you can adapt, you can make decisions, you know what to expect, and you can have a give and take of decisions in that dance. That's kind of what I think of when I think of competent.
So I would like to bring it back to the original metaphor we started with, which was, making a recipe off of a box. The competent person now understands what spices are and can add their own and change the flavor of the dish. They may not necessarily make the best dish, but they now know how, and they can experiment. As Dante was saying, they can guess and check what the right thing to put in here is. And
So-
they know not to substitute salt for sugar.
They know what spices are. You're gonna kill me.
The idea is that Val was asking a few moments ago is what, I guess, to explain it, because I think we used a term that we all understood what we meant, but we didn't explain here, is this idea of a plateau and an eventual decline for advanced beginners who don't make it to competent. And so what we're talking about, with our recipe analogy is that we suddenly know that, like, you can get this if you are a cook, like there are different kinds of dough, and now you understand how to make, that everything that uses cookie batter has a general process behind it. You start integrating those ideas. And the really, hard thing that happens is, as an advanced beginner, you're building up this Rolodex of recipes, but they're all separate, and you can't possibly use them all at once. So what you have to do is consolidate that, which is what this competent step starts doing. And so the question that Val posed moments ago for Dante was, what do you do to get out of advanced beginner into competent?
So I'll go ahead and address that, because I have an answer for that. It's the one that I use with my students is how do I get you into that state? Analysis. Tell me what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do in that type of discussion and analysis. This is the stage where, to borrow a phrase, fighters learn to talk stick, right? This is where we learn how to talk stick. And I'm going to get you to that point where you can tell me why that fight went the way it went. And that's how I bring you from advanced beginner to competent, because I'm training you to look, analyze, and think about how every bit of that fight happens. And what happens as a result of that is that your recipes go away, and you're learning, and you haven't quite gotten there yet, as you know, in the stage of competence. You haven't quite gotten to the point where there aren't any recipes anymore. That's farther down the road. Where there aren't recipes, there's just, here's the situation, how do I respond? And I respond instinctually and correctly. You haven't gotten to that point yet, but the way you get to that point is you sit and you analyze and you think, and you think and you think and you think about what's going on, why it happened, why do I move my feet this way to open this line, why do I do all of that, and that why. And getting from advanced beginner to competent is less about the mechanics and more about the analysis of why things work and why things don't, from my point of view.
Okay. Dante, did you have any follow-up to that?
No.
Okay. So we're looking at that competent level of being able to, have a decision tree, timing and judgment, self-evaluation through guess and check. And there's also, we have a note here about imposter syndrome at this stage. Belbran?
So the level, when you get to the point where you're competent, is sort of where you're, we've talked before about the Dunning-Kruger curve, and it sort of peaks at advanced beginner, right? That's the peak. And then when you become competent, you start to realize just how much you don't know.
Yes.
And that's where you're on the downward side of that Dunning-Kruger curve, and you're heading towards that pit. And the bottom of that pit is where you realize you really don't know. You thought you knew because you've had, perhaps significant, performance. You've done very well in tournaments, and you've chained some skills together, and you've won some things, and you're feeling pretty good about yourself. And then as you become competent, you start to realize how much you don't understand. And that's where you really start to not understand how much you have improved. And you start to feel like an imposter because you don't feel like you're as good as you actually are. And the competent part is really where that starts to come in, because that's on the downward side of that Dunning-Kruger curve, and you are just starting to understand how much you don't know, and that makes a lot of people very insecure about how am I doing, how am I fighting, I obviously I suck, but no, you don't. You're just on the wrong side of that curve.
And when people,
oh, Dante.
Yeah, I was going to say, when people get to that sort of point, keep an eye out for them, because that's probably when they're going to, be their hardest critic, because they're guessing checking, but they're they're coming up with a lot of wrong answers, but now they know they're coming up with wrong answers. But because they're invested in their own performance, this is really the first time where people feel like they're getting stuff wrong because they're failing. Earlier than that, if you're a novice and something doesn't work, you blame the recipe. By the time you get to competency, if something doesn't work, you blame yourself. And there's gradations in between those two extremes. But it's something to watch out for, at your own practices when you have those people that are making those breakthroughs in their development, to make sure that they're not also, careening off a cliff in the process of doing so.
Yeah.
So,
I think it's really important to be supportive in that
Mm-hmm.
phase, because it's really easy to get frustrated, and especially because we have the additional pressure of a award system, and then people add more stress to themselves than necessary while they go through these hard parts.
Yeah, just at the moment where they're starting to understand how many mistakes they're really making.
Yeah, that's it's a small existential crisis of fighting at that point.
well, so to sort of avoid getting way deep into the weeds in neuroscience stuff, this idea, like we've been talking about, you have all these recipes, is a non-consolidated idea as an advanced beginner. And getting into this competent stage is fundamentally a relearning to try to integrate patterns within that randomly large collection of what is essentially very noisy information. And this is essentially how our brains work too. So like when you don't sleep, like you don't do memory consolidation, and that's like why your brain stops functioning in a very hand-wavy way. But the same is true, and it's going to suck because you are fundamentally rewiring your fighting brain in this competent stage. But because this makes a perfect transition to proficient, this is also a point where your progress will rapidly speed up. So I have made a little chart. I don't know if we'll get fancy and edit it here or something. I can send it, but
You can share screen if you have an image available.
here, we can do that.
While he's looking for that, also, Dante, could you post the Dreyfus models in the comments when we YouTube this?
Yeah, certainly.
So is that showing up for you all?
Yep.
It is.
All right, so we were talking about the tale of two fencers is what I called this, but one is going to get stuck in advanced beginner. What happens to them, that's this gray line, is that they get to a certain point, but because everything gets automatic, they get worse. But I really represented this novice because it's very quick to move through it as something you spike out of pretty quickly. This advanced beginner is this generally linear portion of your skill development, your learning. But as soon as you really start integrating, you hit this exponential phase. And so people sometimes are only in, quote, competent for like 6 months as fencers. And then eventually, obviously, you get to expert and you stop improving very quickly because everything gets harder to get better. But that's all I had for that figure. But I think it illustrates this, it sucks because you're relearning everything, but you will also take off pretty quickly. And I think we start seeing that with some people like after, we give them their GOA or their white scarf, who just, something clicks and then they just start winning, which the much hated advice of you just got to win more is at least I think trying to encapsulate, but.
And I think that's terrible advice, because that's looking at performance as opposed to the skill. And the thing that is the skill is I can competently understand what is right, what is wrong, and I don't have to think about a recipe.
Yeah, no, I just
that's skill.
Yeah. After that phenomena very poorly.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point of bringing it up as performance versus skill. We've all sat in order meetings where we've had someone who was like, oh, this person's winning a lot, and we're like, yeah, but like,
yeah. And the flip side of that is, what Val's talking about, where and what Gavin's talking about as well, is once the underlying skills and skill level fall into place, that's the catalyst that gets everything else moving. When you start to connect these different movements together, when you start to integrate them, you start to experience greater success as a byproduct of doing more things right more often. And you have control over whether or not you're doing things right. You don't necessarily have control over the outcome because there's another person and they're trying to stop you. So worrying about performance it's an indicator of skill, but it's not the only indicator. And ultimately, we're looking at, creating patterns and applying them at this point. And if we're ready to transition to proficiency,
I think we can move on to proficiency.
Okay.
And how do we find proficient?
Yeah.
And then,
So the big thing with proficiency is proficient people are taking patterns they already know and they're adapting them to the situation that's in front of them. So they're making modifications, could be small modifications, but meaningful modifications to known patterns. And they're taking existing patterns that they have and they're starting to clump them together, to chunk them, to form patterns of the patterns. And this is what Val was talking about with fight analysis. If you do enough fight analysis, you start to see that these 75 fights that you had were really like 3 or 4 types of fights repeated frequently, over and over again. So a proficient person, instead of guessing and checking, now they've seen enough that they're able to self-correct. They've seen enough that they're able to look at what someone else is doing and learn vicariously through someone else's actions.
I think that's important to highlight, that at the previous steps you can't do that.
Yeah,
you can't do that earlier.
Yeah, Brigid has a wonderful story about her doing precisely this. It's a story of your fight with Donovan.
Oh, yeah. One time I was at a practice and when I lived out in the East Kingdom, and I was fencing someone, Master Donovan at the East, and I was like, what are you doing and where are you hitting me? And he was like, oh, I'm doing this. And I was like, I'll be right back. And I went and I found someone else, worked it out for myself for 20 minutes. They didn't know what I was working on. They just thought they were fighting me. And then I came back and I was like, all right, let's fight again. And he's like, oh, okay. And he's like, oh, you fixed it. That was fast. And I was like, you told me what was wrong. I thought it through. I fixed it. And now I'll have something else that I'm sure you're going to exploit.
And that's a perfect sort of example, because the proficient person is someone, they're able to determine what their goals are or what their goals should be. But they may not be able to immediately know how to reach those goals. And so the proficient person, rather than using drills as a means of developing skills or acquiring skills, proficient person is doing what you just did, what you're talking about, which is using drilling as a form of like root cause analysis to figure out, okay, I know this is happening. I need to now understand the intricacies of it, and I need to formulate a reaction. And that requires taking known patterns, looking at patterns within those patterns, and being able to modify and create a response that's appropriate.
Have you guys watched Queen's Gambit yet?
No.
All right, so this is a mini-series that just came out on Netflix, I think, last week. So hopefully this is timely, and then 3 years from now, everyone will have forgotten. But it's about a girl who becomes a chess master. And one of the things I think they depict pretty well in the first episode is her progress as a child, learning to play chess, and reading the theory books. But one of the things that they depicted in this is when she lays in her bed at night, is picturing the chessboard on the ceiling and working out games and strategies and patterns and cycling through that. And that is the beginning of being able to do that, is going to be part of this proficient stage. You're doing it confident.
In order to not lose my mind doing cardio at the gym, because I hate cardio, I actually do that as well. Like I'll think, hey, I'm fighting this person and they're going to do this, what about this, things like that. And that keeps me from going crazy while just doing this.
Well, I think that Gavin brings out a very important point here, is that at the point of proficiency is where visualization really makes an impact on your fight.
Visualization.
Wherein you can sit there and conjure up and visualize a fight and see that fight in your head and depict it, analyze it, break it down, change it. All of that is, a novice can't do that. An advanced beginner can't do that. Somebody who's competent can't do that, right? When you have that ability to visualize a fight, break it down, and understand exactly what is going on in that fight and how to change it, that's the hallmark of proficiency in my opinion.
Yeah. And that's, and that's not a common skill set. Just to be clear, if we're talking about populations, maybe 8% or so out of an entire population, will be in the proficiency stage. Only about 2% reach expertise, which is why, even when you start to talk about, like award type structures, you kind of, I think it's unreasonable to expect greater than proficiency from people, even at the higher levels, because it's hard enough to get there, but to expect full-on expertise starts to become very unreasonable, because instead of having 20 people fall into eligibility for that, you're instead looking at 4.
Yeah.
And that's not sustainable.
That's when their majesties start telling you they need a candidate.
Right.
Yeah. And I guess, so we haven't really talked about the line between proficient and expert, and we should do that before we wrap up here.
What is the line between proficient and expert?
Well, I would say that the biggest difference between proficient and expert is that everything a proficient person does through thinking things over, an expert knows without thought. They have an intuitive sense of what to do, so they don't have to think it through. They know, I'm being hit in my ribs, so I need to make an adjustment for that. They'll have an intuitive feel for when they've come up with the right answer. And the important thing that separates the expert from those other levels is the intuitions at the other levels of skill are a crapshoot. They might be right, they might be wrong, they're often going to be mistaken. But an expert makes a guess, but the guess is almost always correct. Assuming the expert has the information that they need, they're going to be right. And this can be a really difficult thing to try to teach, because part of it is having experienced enough things so that you're able to say, this situation is like these other things, which are all part of this other group of things, which are all part of this, which are all part of that. And just integrating a tremendous amount of information. And then at the end of it, just saying, yeah, this is right. And I can't really explain why to you, because the fact that you need an explanation means that you won't understand the explanation. And that's a difficult thing to pass along, because it's true for experts in any sort of field. I don't know why, somebody who's in, graphic design, for example, picked this color or this shape or something. But I can look at it and say, yeah, that's good. I like that. But I don't understand the granular components to it. And if somebody who, is a real expert in that field tried to explain to me, their explanation is mostly going to be, well, this is just better. And it is. They're not wrong, but I just don't have the understanding to explain it. If we look at our chefs, our example, of cooking things, if you've ever watched a master chef like season to taste, it's a very different experience than like what I do, which is like, I like salt, so I'm going to add some salt. Whereas watching somebody who really has an understanding of that, they're going to say, it's like, this needs this much salt, and to offset the salt, I'm going to add a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And this type of dish needs an acid, so I'm going to spray some lemon juice on it to counteract and bring, this thing, and to bring out this other flavor. And like, I don't know how to do any of that, but I can cook a decent meal. But the expert level is just so far removed from everything else that the ability to communicate from the expert level down is really, really hard.
I think to keep our cooking, I just wanted to comment, I think that is why Gordon Ramsay is as successful as he is. As a cooking example, he is obviously an expert chef, but what he is able to then do is distill things back to an explanation that at least works.
Yeah.
I really like, at the end, he does an episode of the Hot Ones where you eat the wings, and at the end he teaches how to make an omelet, and it's not the right way that he actually cooks an omelet, but he's able to parse an explanation of it.
I have used that very egg cooking method of his, and it is fantastic. And I'm sure I don't do it as well as him.
Right.
We were, not to get too far off topic, but we were watching one of these master cooking shows, and I started Amazon priming their books as we were watching it because I was so impressed with what they were doing. Bringing it back to the topic at hand, proficient experts.
Yeah.
Since we're almost close to wrapping up this episode. I agree with you, Dante, that expecting much more than proficient is a very difficult and high standard. We have a Duke out here in Ontier that was in an Order of the Chivalry meeting, and he was like, yeah, I can beat that guy. And the king finally stood up and said, everyone raise your hand if you believe you can beat his grace. And one guy raised his hand, and he's like, yeah, your standard's too high. Like, and it's interesting to think about, what that means to the fighting community at large in the SCA and just general expertise. Is how do you get to expert, and is that actually like an organic, homegrown thing? For my part, I know that it's when I'm gearing up for like a QRC or a really important tournament, Valbrand has been a champion to 14 queens and princesses across 4 kingdoms.
4 kingdoms, yeah.
4 kingdoms, yeah. So I look at it as in, I've won a gold medal once. He's won it 14 times. So I'm going to hire the 14-time gold medal winner to be my coach, my tune-up before the tournament. So we'll work on things. And I'm like, all right, give me 15 minutes of this fighter. And he'll be like, all right, And I'm like, all right, now I need 30 minutes of this fighter, and we'll just really work through. And he's like, this person's going to come at you in this way, in this guard, with this technique. And I'm like, okay, we'll work through it and we'll process it and we'll think it through. And that's, you know, one way that I have found to try and bump up my skill where I'm at. But are there any other ways you can think of other than it's homegrown to get to that upper 2%? Like,
well, so I have some thoughts on that. So one of the things that distinguishes an expert from someone who's proficient is origination. Like, they come up with new ways to do a thing. And so this is sort of something that you know is the case when you think about. I like to make the following analogy, right? So proficient is somebody who has a master's degree. They have demonstrated mastery of a topic. A PhD is an expert because they have contributed new knowledge to the world. They figured out something that nobody else has figured out. And that's the difference between, to me, the difference between proficient and expert. And the expert doesn't stop drilling, but their drills have a different purpose. Their drills are, I need to remind myself that I need to be here instead of here, right? You know, it's oh, right, I need to remind myself and remind my muscle memory that, you know, I need to be at this angle, not this angle. And, you know, that was stupid. All right, I'm going to drill that a few times to remind myself of the fact that it needs to be 100% correct. And I guess, you know, that's sort of the thing. One of the things that I like to say about, you know, the difference between somebody who's an expert and somebody who's proficient is watch the fight. When you're watching the fight, a proficient fighter is arguing about measure, right? We're going to have an argument about distance. We're going to get to the right place. And then that's going to be the end of the fight.
We're going to argue over half an inch.
Like that's the expert. The expert is arguing over half an inch. I don't care about the rest of it. I'm caring about 1/2 of an inch, and that's all I need. And that's the argument that they're having. And getting to that point from proficient to expert is literally just experience. You have to have enough experience to understand intuitively how people move, how the sword works, such that it's just literally just part of your fundamental being. And that's just experience.
Yeah, I like to jokingly tell people that the way that you can tell an expert is the degree to which this statement makes sense to them, which is, for every rule, caveats apply, except for when they don't. And if that makes total sense to you and you're completely comfortable with it, you might be an expert. If that sounds really frustratingly unhelpful, you're not quite there yet.
True facts.
I don't know about helpful.
Gavin?
A shared frustration about those caveats.
Well, we've all learned something then.
All right. So are there any final closing points on this episode?
Well, so, I mean, the last thing we have written down in our notes, aside from Dante's joke there, is how do you find experts when you're not an expert?
Well, I would say that the people that, whether or not it turns out to be that the person is an expert or not, because that can be splitting hairs at a certain point, and obviously there are degrees of expertise. But if you're looking for someone to learn from, that person, look for someone who can tell you what to do, can tell you what to do in a way that it makes sense to you, can tell you what to do in a way that is effective for you, and can tell you what to do in a way where if something doesn't work, they can understand immediately or very quickly why it wasn't working and make adjustments, and those adjustments will make it work. The expert type person, the critical thing for them is their guesses aren't really guesses, and they just need a little bit of time to figure stuff out, and they're going to be able to impart it to you. And if you find someone who can tell you what to do, who can make it work for you, and who can correct you in an effective and constructive way, that person's probably an expert or pushing along in that direction. And they're certainly someone to learn from.
So,
Well,
I guess one of the things that Dante touched on is if you look at it population wise,
2%.
only about 2%. Only about 2% of your population is going to be experts. So if you sit down in your kingdom and you are, an integral part of that fighting community, you should know who those 2% are. You will have encountered them. You will have fought them, and you will be able to readily identify them. And if you are a novice, you may not understand the distinction between somebody who is competent and somebody who is an expert. If you're an advanced beginner, you may not understand that as well. But when you see that, I like to say it like this, you know expertise when you see it. And when you see somebody on the field, you will know if they are an expert or not. And that's, hard in a way. But I think that, it's important to understand that, that really, they're only 2%, and we should be able to identify them.
I think one of the difficulties in the SCA is, especially for novices and advanced beginners, is people look to the award structure to tell them who's at what skill level, and as you get up in the award structure, you realize that may not always be the case. And so it's a little more difficult for a novice to look for an expert.
Yeah, I think I would disagree to a certain extent, or at least add caveats to what Val just said. So both Val and I,
They apply.
Except when they go.
Our PhD, and the best way, the way you get one is that you are recognized by other people who have one, right? So experts can recognize experts. And I would say proficient people can generally recognize experts, but I would be very cautious to say that people who are not proficient yet can recognize experts or other proficient people.
I agree with that.
And we point out, like, the award structure doesn't map perfectly to this. But there was so Neil Peart was the drummer for Rush, right? There's a saying, I forget who said it, but Neil Peart was your favorite drummer's favorite drum. Which really turns into, so you're gonna, if you're a novice or an advanced beginner, there's someone you might look up to, and you're gonna think they are amazing. And maybe they are, but maybe they're just an advanced beginner who beats everyone at your practice and is nice to you, which is a fine thing to be. But you can look at who they look up to, and you can look at who those people look up to, and eventually you'll find the person that's the top dog, right? So if you're, the novice trying to figure out, who should you be listening to, see who the people you think you should be listening to are listening to.
Or alternatively, if you go far enough up that chain till you find somebody that, is the person that the people you listen to are listening to, ask them who they hate to fence or who they love to fence, depending on the personality of the person.
Who they love to fence but don't want to face in finals of Queen's Rapier.
Right. This is my favorite person to spar with and least favorite person to get in round one of a single limb.
Yeah. And the other caveat, really quickly, I would add, with experts only being 2%, the stats actually say that most of our kingdoms don't have one.
That's true, and that's okay. And I want to stress that that's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. You don't need an expert,
right,
in the technical sense of the word, to progress, to become an expert, right? By and large, experts become experts because they're self-driven to become so. And like we were talking about, right? The difference between proficient and expert is a certain sense of drive to become better and figure it out. Solve the skill, right? The skill is how to sword good, and an expert is just driven to understand how to sword good. And you can get that, you can get there without having an actual expert to take you there. You need a competent teacher, and so you need to find somebody who is at least competent, who can understand why things work and why things don't, can guess and check and figure out the right answer. And so as long as you can find somebody who is competent, you can work together to become an expert.
All right.
Two people working together can definitely achieve quite a lot that they couldn't by themselves.
That's why I have a coach.
That's
all right. What was that, Gavin?
And that's our next episode.
And that's our next episode. All right. So thank you very much for tuning in with us. We will have another episode when we get around to filming it. I know we've been a little inconsistent with our time frames, but we'll be back when we're back. Thank you very much, and we'll see you again.
Thank you, everyone.